I think there's just so much sensitivity, obviously, around the accounting numbers and financials that just needed attention for transparency and accuracy. I think in the HR space, you see a few things where they're starting to become sort of centers of gravity and sort of the HR analytics standards. I think one I've used in the past was the PwC Saratoga report has significant number of benchmarks in it.
Hello and welcome to the Future Proof HR podcast, where we're exploring cutting-edge trends shaping the future of HR, people operations, and overall the way we work. I'm your host, Thomas Kunjappu, founder and CEO of Cleary, and today I'm excited to welcome Craig Haydamack, the Chief Human Resources Officer at USIC. Craig's a seasoned HR and business leader with over 25 years of experience in a career that has spanned many industries and including roles, which we will get deeply into, starting with finance and strategies or organizational design, and of course, with a focus on operational excellence. Craig has had a focus on HR analytics, talent acquisition, and leadership development, and I think brings a unique perspective at this time where the role of HR itself seems to be shifting beneath our feet. So with no further ado, Craig, welcome to the podcast.
All right, Thomas, thanks so much. Real glad to be here and looking forward to our discussion.
So can we start with just your career journey? Because I think you had a pretty unique path into becoming a CHRO. Could you just give us the highlights of that and the key kind of pivot and transition points?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So yeah, really kind of a different path to HR. I actually started working for Intel for a farm credit system, an agricultural bank, doing financial analysis right out of college. And at a place where you had to know your numbers and balance everything to the dollar every day. So did that for several years and then hopped over to Intel, their IT group managing a small decision support analytics team. Worked through there for about 12 years through a variety of IT roles and found my way into working in the IT systems for HR, which is this accidental good bridge into the HR function, and then worked through several different roles in that area and had the good fortune to make to the CHRO role. Some of the things that we'll talk about today, I know that the use of analytics and data and storytelling has been honestly just part of my career, literally from the very first day of work after college. So.
The shift seems to be like from analytics and into towards IT analytics, people analytics, and then more broadly into the broader people and HR function. So
Yep.
then when you were making all those transitions, did it feel natural or were there any kind of key pivot points, especially when you went from IT to HR?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was actually natural. I think each transition, I think it's good for people making shifts is it was almost like you found a role that was 1 foot in your previous role and 1 foot into the new role. So like when I went into from IT to HR, I was really in the IT system or the HR systems area. And so I got to learn about the function and the data and things like that. So I was still in a comfort zone of IT, but able to work into that way. Similar when I went from the bank to Intel, doing the analytics work, that was the crossover position there. So I think for any of us, as we kind of network and look at new roles, finding something where you have some skills, even if it's a different function or company, you have skills that can be immediately applicable to step in and get yourself running. That makes a big difference.
So tell me about analytics specifically and how you've applied analytics in the HR function.
So what I've found over time, all the way through my different career stops, was using analytics, and really what it came down to is storytelling and being able to tell stories and influence things outward and upward in the organization. So outward meaning connecting with your peers and helping to get lined up with them in different ways, and upward in terms of helping to influence the direction of the business. And I think that so many business leaders, the language of business is accounting. They're thinking through different items through the lens of the financial statement and the accounting and the numbers. And so that ability to translate your HR data into meaningful business data is really key. I say to my team, sometimes we almost have to put our CFO hats on a little bit to be able to make that influence. And so throughout it, blending the HR data, turnover data, compensation trends, wage inflation, whatever it may be, and be able to link it back to here's the financial impact on the company and be able to make that clear story and connection, that makes a huge difference. I think sometimes HR can get trapped in, we know conceptually what HR should do and our concepts and things, and they're the right textbook things to do, but that may not always be motivating or for a business leader who really is thinking about it from the numbers. So wherever you can blend in the financials with your HR data and draw a connection, you're in a much better, more powerful place.
I wonder if you can make some of the same claims or observations, which is that in IT, you might be in the day-to-day focused on what are the specific projects that like you're working on. And ultimately, you need to be able to translate those investments and that time into something that the CFO's office or the leadership in general can really understand, which could map into P&L. Is there a difference? You've been on both sides of this.
Yeah. Actually, they're really the same. And I'll use an example. You think in IT, we think of, we want to invest in this piece of software and here's the cost and here's the efficiency we'll get out of it. It's really the same flow. You think about, let's say you want to invest in a new recognition system for the company. Here's the startup cost. Here's what we believe the usage rate will be. And then if we're able to raise up the engagement level, we think we can bring the turnover in the company down by 5%. That's the ROI on this. They're very similar, but taking those sometimes can be a little bit of softer HR concepts and tying it back to hiring success, quality of hire, retention, engagement level, any of those types of things, safety, et cetera. And then you could put a dollar value on those, then you're in a really good shape. I think they're actually very similar. And I think from the audience standpoint, they prefer to see it in a similar way versus getting completely different storylines through different functions. So
Yeah, that said, I can't help but feel like the job is a little bit harder on the HR side in the sense that in IT, the investments that you're making are typically all about increasing productivity. You're changing a manual workflow, a paper-based workflow, or a less automated workflow, or a many hours focused type of workflow, and you're making it more efficient, often with software or like a better workflow,
yeah,
or a better tool. And some of that also exists in HR. However, the other half of the story, which you can actually impact, is, as you mentioned, retention, engagement, and potentially directly onto the revenue side, or obviously on the talent acquisition, it comes in like much more quickly. So the surface area of things you can impact could arguably be higher, but also it's harder to make those jumps and make those claims. So that's what I'm really excited about our conversation today, because I know you have some great examples, right? That will really try to bring things home for folks about how can you take conceptually what you think are great programs that you might want to do that's going to engage employees and it's going to be great for the company, but then it's really in the details, right? In that gap, even if you conceptually know, and I'm talking that your classic HR professional who's coming in with the right idea about the programs that they want, but is just really looking for the right language and the tools to have the conversation with folks. And let's boil it down to the CFO, that kind of the
yep.
CFO's office. Then you also talked about the concept of storytelling. We started talking about analytics, but could you tell me a little bit more about how you think about storytelling through analytics and how you combine the two and why that's important?
I think a common mistake, not just in HR, but in different functions, is you're trying to put together a story to influence something, right? Influence a decision, influence a change of direction, wherever it may be. And a common pitfall that folks have is they will unintentionally say, let me show you all the good work I've done. So I'll take you through this spreadsheet. I'll take you through this spreadsheet. I'll take you through this spreadsheet. And it's like, you want to show all your work versus the audience really doesn't, I hate to say they don't care, but they don't care. They want to see like a chapter storybook. Here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's what we've researched across the company. Here's what other companies are doing. Here's why we think is important. Now let us show you our numbers in a concise way. And so I think that getting it down to almost sometimes with group where we actually will sit down and just take a blank spreadsheet, write out, okay, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, what are the things that we want to build this story, or almost like building a legal case or a court case. If you think, how do we build this story along the way and what pieces are going to come in what order? That is really important, and avoiding the trap of just trying to do all your work, because then you're just really making the audience redo everything you've already done. I think the other piece I'd add on it is that recognition of the attention span, right? I think I've read something not too long ago that the average American attention span went from 15 seconds to 8 seconds. And so I'll say
Quick to
to
say, I was on Twitter. No,
exactly.
yeah.
Sometimes it's down to 3 maybe, but yeah, if you think about this, is this a 5-minute slide or is this a 3-minute slide or is this an 8-second slide? And I think sometimes we historically think of, okay, 3 minutes a slide, whatever. I think the reality is your audience may give you about 8 to 10 to 12 seconds to read it and absorb it. And if you aren't getting it across in that space, you probably missed it. And I'd say the last comment is, you think about a slide that's just words. You're trying to influence a group and you're trying to talk as a presenter and I can't listen to you and I can't read this page of stuff at the same time. I have to pick one or the other. and you end up distracting the audience unintentionally. And so I think the more that groups can use visuals, whether it be a graph or an infographic or sometime with here's the message I want you to take away, you can get through those stages of this chapter of the story really quickly and move them to where you need them to be versus making it like reading through a 5,000 page novel or something that's difficult to get through in terms of the story. So I think that storyboarding and think of those quick 8 to 10, 15-second modules. I think that really helps put some boundaries around it as for anybody who's putting their story together.
Interesting. So you're really actually talking a lot about storytelling and communication sort of skill sets, right? Where you want to be clear and crisp with your message, think about your audience, and be empathetic to what their needs are, not necessarily what your needs are in the pursuit of communicating whatever it is you're communicating. So that's a skill set. But then the other side, the other half of it is analytics, right? So showing your work presumes that someone has done a lot of work, right? Taken data from an ATS or an HRIS, put it into a spreadsheet, done a bunch of analyses and pivot tables and put it into different types of graphs. And now you have like too much of something, right? Which that's, I think, the other end of what you're talking about. But to get to that, there's some skill sets around just analysis. Let me just leave you with this question there.
Yeah.
Given how you come in from the IT and analytics side
Yeah.
to HR, when you think about your peers and what in the industry on the HR side, what are those skill sets in terms of analysis and analytics that you need in really just different functions and different sub functions and all the way up to CHRO when you think about the concept of analytics as a skill set?
In that space? Yeah, definitely. So I think depending on the HR, two things to this, I'd say. One is, and I've shared this with a few early career groups over time, and it's really simplistic, but I think it's a good self-test. I said, if you can go and open up Excel and you can be a pivot table wizard, use all those different things and use that to grind through the data, use all the formulas, things like that. And if you can go in and you can make a graph and you can figure out how to configure it, change the scales, change the colors, add things into it. If you can do those two things, the beginnings to be able to go do that analysis work, it's really simplistic. It's amazing how many folks maybe don't have those basic skills, and that becomes a roadblock right at the beginning. So I think that if I was saying somebody starting off early career, I think those business analysis skills are critical. Just those two basic things, right? I don't always have time to go and learn Tableau and bigger systems. That'd be great if you can, and some roles require that. But if you had those basics, the other one I'd say is basic project management. So if you're going to try to advance in your career, you got to use the analytics and tell stories to be able to influence, but then you've got to have just the basic project management skills. Let's write a scope, let's get a chart, let's organize a team so you can actually drive a change through to success. So if I was starting off at the very beginning, those are the two things I'd have right at the beginning. I think to your question around different HR functions, I think an area like compensation team, for example, that's a function that really needs to have that strong analytic skill set, advanced Excel skills and other tools and Power BI tools and things like that. That one's that really needs it. The total rewards area to some degree. And the other one I'd say is for a function like talent acquisition, especially if you have a larger organization with a lot of volume, you almost need to be able to have the same type of basic understanding and metrics of the manufacturing environment with incoming applicants, the flow, delays in the system, delays in fallout rate, things like that. And so be able to use some of those sort of manufacturing supply chain type of concepts at a basic level that can really help in that type of a function. Let's say if you're in a talent acquisition or in an HR operational or help desk type of area. So
That's really helpful. One more kind of exploration I'd like to do with you is around
yeah,
just the function of people analytics, right? Which has come in as an expert analytic function
yes.
specifically focused on people data, right? How are you seeing that evolving? Because the conversation we just had speaks at least some basics that you need to have across the board.
Mhm.
Is that specialization potentially going away where it's actually just a piece, part and parcel of every other like function, or how
Yeah,
do you see that evolving as we move
space.
forward?
A great question. I think really you need both. I think the kind of as the competition rises, you need to have that broad skill set so that people are able on an ad hoc basis as they're exploring data, asking questions, they can go and address that. So I think you need it across the board. I do think a deep people analytics function is really important and valuable. And I think of them taking on the really complex questions. They're going to take extensive research, extensive analysis, maybe more advanced statistical questions. I think those functions also are probably more likely to go out and do external research on benchmarking trends and labor market trends and things like that and bring that in. And I think those types of really strategic questions require a people analytics function. So I think they're going to continue to be needed and grow in importance. I think there's actually a little bit of a bridge in the middle where things like Power BI and some of the dashboard tools are getting better and better. And I think the more people are able to learn some of those items and just set up some of the standard recurring reports analysis things, that sort of helps almost be a little bit of a bridge between those two worlds. So I'd see the basic skill sets are always going to be critical. I think the ability to build the dashboards and those kind of things, the more we have folks that have those skill sets and configure repeatable monitors and alerts and reports and things is important. And then you got to have the people analytics folks for those really complex questions, like how is the sensitivity to our wage changes to attrition or whatever that may be, or sensitivity to shift schedules with our employee engagement, all those really complex things that require a lot of different types of data coming together.
Yeah, and speaking of dashboards and just things just becoming more standardized in the world of finance with gap accounting,
Mhm.
the whole function has come to shared understanding of what it means, for example, for a company to
Mhm.
make money or net income or gross profit, lots of different
Mhm.
terms are standardized. There have been attempts on the human capital side to do something similar, but we haven't really seen that come to fruition.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts on why, or are you seeing that happening more and more?
I think there's just so much sensitivity, obviously, around the accounting numbers of financials that just needed attention for transparency and accuracy. I think in the HR space, you see a few things where they're starting to become sort of centers of gravity and sort of the HR analytics standards. I think one I've used in the past was the PwC Saratoga report has significant number of benchmarks in it and a really rich set of definitions around each one of those, which is really helpful. I think given the challenge of this is I think the advice I'd have is have it. I'll use turnover as an example. If you're sharing turnover with leadership, and let's say you may, on your leadership team, you may have people that have come from 3 or 4 different companies and they're just subconsciously have different definitions. Turnover is calling out that definition and putting it on there, either a footnote or saying, hey, when we talk about turnover, we're including voluntary, involuntary, we're removing people that were retired or any kind of corporate restructuring or whatever that definition is. But I think proactively calling it out, because otherwise you get into your presentation and somebody starts wanting to debate the numbers and then you got to go backwards to try to backtrack and get it done. So I think calling that out right at the beginning is really important. The other one I'd say is, I think as we're using benchmarks, the more we can use benchmarks, the better, and being able to call out the definitions of those. It's hard to get a perfect apples to apples benchmark, but one of the ones I like to use is the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a website called Fred. It has a longer name, but it's Fred is the one. And you can go on and pull any labor market indicator or segment you can ever possibly imagine and blending those on. And they're always going to be apples to apples, but to say, hey, here's our definition of turnover. And by the way, we're going to hold up next to it let's say the US economy separation rate or quit rate or whatever. It's got a slightly different definition, but from a strategy standpoint, we can look at these and see, are they directionally the same or opposite, things like that. So I think just proactively working that into your talking points helps. So you don't find yourself having to dig out of a hole later on. So
Uh, Great point, especially for boards who are increasingly interested in these kind of metrics from the CHRO's office. They are, by definition, going and seeing many versions of this across
yes.
different companies at the same time with slightly different definitions. So there's a bit of a challenge built in. But I love your challenge for the industry, right? To be looking at benchmarks for any particular report you might have for your company. Think about what external benchmark, whether that's something related to your industry broadly for the country or in any kind of macroeconomic factor or like a source like BLS, or it could be from a particular consulting agency that has some specialty on your particular industry.
Mhm.
That's a great point. So you're getting into some of the examples, which I would love to dig into here. I think, and maybe the way to frame this, right, is that, hey, if you want to tell stories with data that influence your exec team, your board, your peers to see the world in the same way around human capital, as well as from that logically what priorities or what investments
Mhm.
you might want to make. so that you're furthering goals with a shared view. That's the goal. And Craig, you were gracious enough to dig up some examples that we can go through, which hopefully for folks bridge that gap between, I know these are the programs we need to do, or this is the way I need to be talking about something, but then I need to get everyone else on the same page. And so let's get into some of these like details. And
Sure.
we're really excited to hear these examples.
Excellent. Let me share my screen out with the group here. All right, we'll go to full screen. Okay. First of all, this is all simulated data. None of this is from any of my employers, current or past, but it is sort of reminds me of some projects I've worked on in the past, and I thought they would be good demonstrations. I think the key thing to think about this is that, again, that idea of that attention span, you got 8 or 10 seconds to get your point across. And you also have a place where somebody's talking and presenting, and you've got folks, audience who are reading at the same time. And the faster you get through the messages and the more synchronized your comments are with what they're seeing, the smoother it goes. So here, for example, was a concept where looking at attrition drivers, what the attrition is in different stages of an employee's tenure, and how the attrition, what the top attrition driver is shifts over time. And so that idea, I think, of taking the data, depending on the situation, overlaying the little key comments that you want, so you can see the data and put a little interpretation right there with it. I think it makes it easier for the audience. Like in this example, you can go right through, you can see what the 4 drivers are, you can see the times where they're at. And then in this case, the presenter may be saying, these are the project priorities I want to recommend for next year, and I want to get management alignment on it. And so the idea is you can try to cover a lot of ground very quickly, showing the big picture and the data, versus getting caught and doing a 15-slide flip through different things, trying to build up a case. If you can put it all together in a comprehensive view, I think that's really what you're going for. Another example is one around turnover and financial benchmarks. And in this case, you have the backdrop here in gray is the turnover rate for the company. And then the blue line represents the gap between how far below the wages for this company are below what the benchmark is. And the corresponding story here is, hey, when our wages were 16, 17% behind market, our turnover was really high. As soon as we invested in wages and got closer to the market, we saw an immediate downturn in turnover, which is in the green box. And then later on, as wage inflation took off and we started to fall behind again, we started to see our turnover rate ramp back up. In this case, trying to put 2 sort of interlinked data elements together to show how they visually track side by side over time. And I always think it's helpful just to somehow put a call out on there to say, hey, I want you to see this and I want you to read this. And using the colors, this is where it was good, this is where it was bad. And the other piece of it is, what is that bottom line message? If you had 5 seconds to deliver your story, put in that blue bar at the top what you want the audience to see. Like in this case, it says, important that we remain within 10% of the market benchmarks to limit turnover. And in this hypothetical, we recommend a 5% merit budget for 2024. And that's higher than the US benchmark average. And that will get us back into a healthier place from a turnover standpoint. So again, that idea, I think, of using the visuals, putting sometimes multiple data elements together, a little bit of a story overlay and a takeaway message. You can get through it in 8 seconds. And sometimes your leadership group wants to stop and really engage and talk about this. So in some cases, you may talk about this for 5 or 6 minutes, but you can cover a huge landscape of the situation. You get time, you can get data interrelationships, you can see the ups and downs, et cetera. And it helps you to get that, again, quickly get that story across.
So this is a great example of actually putting a lot of information in one slide, because you have the problems and the problem statements broken down by tenure, as well as the solutions. And you're inviting the audience match both of them. So the data work is obviously collecting this information on the back end and ensuring that you're able to slice the feedback, and the graphs are cut off everywhere, right? But you are ultimately, for each segment, which you're making a choice on how you're even defining tenures as the 6 groups, you're being thoughtful about how you want to divide them up. And you're not showing all the data. You're only showing the most important thing for that particular segment as like a visual choice. So I'm just calling out some of the things that kind of stood out to me in terms of visual communication that is really trying to focus the audience on the particular narrative.
That's exactly right. You're trying to almost keep all the noise out. Like in this graph, very simply, you could have an x-axis that has all the percentages with 3 decimal points, whatever. It just adds sort of noise to the slide and distraction, and it helps taking any of that sort of extra unnecessary stuff out. Helps just trying to narrow that audience right into the core message. If you look at like an annual report for a big public company and you go through the first few pages of their management discussion analysis, you're going to see graphs that are very simple. They've taken all sort of the noise out of them, and you can get them and you can absorb it in 2 seconds. And so I think that's an important sort of underlying part of this. And I think the use of color also helps. Hey, just to help steer people and frame the different stages.
Yeah, you're editing. This is not news. Is the editorial, right? Like you are coming in with a point of view, and so the data you're sharing is to try to reinforce that point of view. Of course, you're being trusted to form that point of view objectively, but then ultimately to convince a jury of your peers, you really want to come in with the piece of information and only the pieces of information that is really relevant.
That space.
This really brings that home.
And I think the little thing to think about in this is, in a way, when you're trying to influence an audience, I almost think of it a little bit as like a thermometer. You think about a thermometer, you're trying to raise money or reach some goal. With your audience, in a way, you're trying to get the trust and credibility thermometer up with that audience to say, you want them to see the data. You also want them to have that underlying impression of, okay, this team's really done their homework. They've dug into the data. I trust them. This makes sense, that they don't need to go through every possible detail. They can see it here and they know that all the hard work was done behind the scenes, and they can focus in on making the decision.
Wonderful. So then can we just move forward to the next example
Yep.
you had here? So this is a great example of taking external benchmarks and marrying it with internal data, right? So it obviously tells a story very directly here, but in general, you're collecting your internal data, but then around turnover, and then you're thinking about as a framework, okay, what external benchmark data could I compare this with to help tell a story? So you say, we have this kind of turnover. We have a hypothesis that it's because of, I don't know, we went remote, or we, I don't know, opened up a new type of office, or we had a significant shift in leadership, or in this case, we had a change for market in terms of just actual wages, or maybe whatever the hypothesis is. But in this case, arguably you went through all of those to get to the point where you have a point of view, and then took some data, not just to say, hey, look, our turnover is down, and you could just imagine this slide without the blue graph and try to make the same case, but it's just easier to argue with, I would say, if without that blue graph.
Exactly. Or you'd say that you want to tell the story, but you have to tell it in 4 or 5 slides, and you have to trust that the audience is remembering each slide and correlating all the data and seeing the patterns. The longer it takes you to put the case together, the lower the success rate. So I think if you can get multiple elements together and show how they interrelate, that makes a big difference. And again, taking out the noise, like in this case, this hypothetical case, you could have put in another line for the benchmark line. You could have put in the wage history, a bunch of other stuff. Really what matters is the gap. In this scenario, the gap to market. So trying to narrow it in on that piece of data that really is what somebody needs to see and take the noise out of it. So.
Love it.
Well, here's another example. This is one that from a prior company, long time ago, had a similar discussion, but actually using maps. And I think especially in our people area, I think sometimes we underestimate, or we don't always use the mapping, the location type of visuals that can help have a big impact on the story, especially when you have a distributed workforce. Like in this case, in this hypothetical case, we were looking at a plant and attrition rate. And the hypothesis is the distance we're trying to recruit people, and where we're going to have the most success recruiting people, and where are we going to start to lose people. We had some comments and surveys that said, hey, it's really about commute time. So we went in and we plotted where all our employees were. We plotted where all the voluntary attrition was in the previous year. And we basically plotted addresses, home addresses. And you could start to see in this hypothetical example that there was a pretty clear distinction that you got beyond 24 miles, that voluntary attrition went way up. And in this example, you could say, let's just limit our recruiting to this certain area, but there may not be enough labor market there. So in this case, you say we might think about, given the turnover rate, would it be cheaper for us to put in a bus service from these locations, and it would be cheaper to us to run a shuttle service than keep having to hire and retrain people over time. I think sometimes like this with a leader, they can see it and then it's engaging and interesting and they can ask questions on it. Again, they can see in this hypothetical, you can see where the plant is, you can see where the attrition is, you can see where you might put the bus stops, things like that, to try to influence them to move down a shuttle program. So
That's fascinating. Yeah, because you can either stick with the status quo and be okay with this kind of attrition, or you expect a leaky bucket and you invest more in talent acquisition, just expect this to be the model and not complain about it. Or you could have new locations in this case, or you can write a shuttle is another kind of solution. It invites the discussion on very much how you're going to operate. It brings the problem to the foreground very clearly.
and you could take it like in this hypothetical case, you probably got survey data. I think about a situation a long time ago, and we saw survey data from folks that were either declining to join the company or leaving because of the commute and the cost of the commute and the gas prices, things like that. So we had hints from surveys that there was something going on, and then using the analytics and the visual to help get the point across to management that might be better for us to invest in a different model here versus the cost of turnover. So, and then one other one I had here is another one, similar theme here of taking multiple data store items, showing the trend over time, showing how they interrelate that story. This is an example of, let's say if somebody's in a benefits team or a total rewards team and looking at the history of the benefits cost for the company per person. And like in this hypothetical, you can see what the U.S. medical inflation rate has been over time. Say it's from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example. And you could take your generic company and show how you've performed. You can also look in this case to see, looking back, what are the different actions that have been taken by this benefits team at this company to hold those costs down, still providing service to the employees, but trying to hold the cost down and be able to bring that inflation rate for the company below what the rest of the labor market is facing. And again, this is the kind of thing that very helpful for CHRO, very helpful for the finance community, CEO, and even at a board level to understand over time, how's the company progressing? Are we doing a good job of managing our benefits and our costs, or are we falling behind? And so this is another, again, overlaying multiple data items and a little historical narrative of what happened, and it helps get that point across. They don't have to listen to a 5-minute conversation. The audience, especially our senior audience that are high numbers and financial acumen, they'll be able to absorb this very quickly on their own, and you get onto the discussion that can be very helpful.
How do you think about your audience when you're storytelling with data? Because at a high level, you might be presenting to your employees. You might be presenting to privately with one VP or executive, or you might be presenting to the board or the entire executive team. And those are the big kind of buckets I can imagine. But
Yep.
how do you think about presentation, especially of data with different audiences like that?
With those groups, yeah. It's a great question. I think if we take the scenario of a large audience that you think about you're presenting to 100 people, and in that space, you're not necessarily trying to get down to the nuts and bolts detail of each element. That's more of a small setting, but you want to educate them on what's happening, the trends and those broad stories. Some things that we just looked at might be a little bit detailed for that, maybe not, but the simpler the graphs are, the more noise you can take out of it, and a very simple message of, I'm thinking a hypothetical example, we're striving to cut our turnover by 10%. Here's the story, here's the visual, here's where the goal line is, and why is it so important? So keeping it very simple, very broad, big picture for that audience is key. Again, that broad audience can get it. I think if you're in that small, let's say you're in a small boardroom setting or a small senior management setting, they're going to want to go deeper. I think in that case, there's a couple things I would suggest. One is, I think if you know the room, if you know people in that room, you can start to profile a little bit and say, I know this person's going to worry about cost. This person's likely to worry about compliance. This person's going to worry about this. And so we have, here's a couple of points. So I talk to this. I want to make sure I mention this because this will resonate with this person. I'm going to mention this because it resonates with this person. So I think a little bit of profiling in a positive way, profiling the group about what their interests are and having a couple comments ready, it makes a huge difference because then you're talking to them and you're proactively engaging them in this versus waiting for them to ask a question. They're like, oh, this speaker's thinking about this. They're ahead of it. And that adds a lot of confidence very quickly. I think the other element I think about that is, as we talked earlier about that idea for a smaller group, more of an intense, detailed discussion on a business case or something, mapping out that storyboard up at the front to follow it through. Not everybody will agree with this. I tend to avoid trying to do an appendix. I think when you get in those presentations, oh, I've got this appendix and you're flipping back and forth, you can just lose the whole vibe of the meeting and the flow. I really try to avoid that at all costs, and usually, frankly, don't even use one. There may be situations where you need it, but trying to minimize that at all costs is really important. I think the other thing I'd say is just managing your time. I've seen this happen where somebody goes in and makes a presentation with a senior group. You got an hour meeting and they use 55 minutes and they don't leave enough time for anybody to discuss and debate. Whatever that discussion is, you've got an hour, 20 minutes to a half hour max of material. Absolutely. And then let the room breathe and discuss and debate. And you can flex with the discussion. That makes a huge difference. And that's where that idea of kind of analytics of telling big stories in minimal space makes a big difference versus trying to flip them through 25 different exhibits to make a point.
On the point about appendices, I've actually run into that myself because I tend to have in my presentations an appendix where I get to say, oh, that's a great question. In fact, I've considered that. Let me show you.
Mhm.
And it gets to the point of, oh, I am thinking about this particular angle or what this particular stakeholder might be thinking about.
Mhm.
But then it could be an invitation to rabbit hole and we go back to the time management. So it's a little bit tricky. I've definitely gotten stuck in that way. But then I love this concept of time management and just one-to-one. If it's a smaller group where primarily if you're presenting to your exec team board, whatever the time is, cut it in half in terms of the amount of time that you're giving yourself to present any kind of information
Yeah.
and expect the richness of the discussion to carry it through the rest of the time. Or if it's crystal clear, everyone's aligned, that's great. And actually, because now you've gone to alignment in 30 minutes, but then it also goes back to your storyboarding idea because you really have to have dialed in what it is you want to say if you need to be able to say it in half the time, right? You just have to be super crisp with it. And I've noticed that it's actually your fluency with data really comes into play in the back half in 30 minutes. So you might spend a lot of time preparing the ultimate story. So let's go with your example around wages and attrition. We haven't mapped our wages to inflation or to keep up with the market. And because of that, we need to do that. And that's the program push. And there might be all types of data focused questions like that might come in the back half for discussions. Like, is that for corporate employees or which external stat did you use? Does that actually map properly to our zip code? In my function, I've heard anecdotally X. So how would you consider that? Because I don't see that in the data, right? There's all types of little details and different perspectives. It's not necessarily that people are questioning the perspective being brought, but intellectually people are trying to get alignment. Yeah, how do you, broadly speaking, right? And it's hard to speak in the abstract here, but manage that in a way that's productive when you
Yeah.
have that extra 30 minutes. But that's the point, to get alignment, but not all the data is presented, nor can it be. So how
Yeah.
do you think about that?
Really good question. I think a couple things I'd say on it. One is you got your material. It's really basic, but always make sure you at the end, last slide is what's the decision you want, or we'd like to get approval. I've seen this happen where somebody makes a great presentation and there's no sort of ending point, and then the group discuss debate and they walk out. Nobody knows what was agreed to. So have something where you're saying, okay, whoever the sponsors are, person A, B, C, you all are the decision makers in this space. I'd like to give you the final word in this discussion and the guidance you want to give us to us. So I think that it's a little tiny thing, but setting it up so you have a clear resolution of our discussion can really help. I've learned over time that if I go to present to a board meeting, I'll have a little flip of paper that I'll do the night before, and I'll have the turnover, the number of employees. So we have the average wage rate, the average tenure rate, whatever it is. There's probably 10 or 15 HR metrics that the group will tend to ask that may not be in your presentation, but in the HR universe that they're going to want to ask about that to help paint the context around it. But you make that mistake a couple of times of not having that at your fingertips. That's a tough day. So I always sit down the night before and write out those 10 or 15 things that I have them on my item. And if somebody has them, you're there. And that really helps because they know your numbers, you've done your homework, and you can ask the question and you add to your credibility. And so I think when you get in those discussion spaces, if you can, as much as reasonably possible, have a few of those supporting things. You don't necessarily, again, have to have 40 pages of backup material. Sometimes it's just having the note card that you can speak to it and you're just in the dialogue. That makes a huge difference.
This is great. So basically you're saying that's your backdoor appendix.
That's my backdoor. Yes. It's a good way to say it. It's the appendix that nobody can get to. Yes.
I like it. I guess one thing just about data communication and storytelling, right? So we've been focused on this format, which is about presentation, live sessions, sitting around a group in a room synchronously, going through visual PowerPoint style visual format, right? That doesn't have to be the only way things happen, right? You talked earlier about attention spans, and it's not just about, 7-year-olds and teenagers. It's also about execs and boards, right? But
Mhm.
some companies fight back. Amazon famously, right, with no presentations, we're going to do 15-page memos. And the expectation is everyone reads these memos in depth and you have to understand it. You comment it up if needed asynchronously beforehand. And then you get to like alignment and going. I'm curious if you've ever come across these other types of ways to align groups, because that's ultimately what we're doing here, aligning the group around a decision
Yeah.
and doing that in a way where everyone feels like intellectually satisfied and we're aligned on the pathway forward. There's pros and cons all around, but have you seen any kind of great decisions or useful decisions or important decisions come out in these other non-presentation sort of formats?
I think that the dynamic you described, the pre-read preparation is a really, in some cases, that's the foundation of the meeting. I think most board meetings, that's the way it goes, is right. You've got to get your materials a week early and the expectation of board members are reading it, taking notes, and they come in. You're really just, you're using the materials just to be a little bit of a discussion guide, but you're really not presenting. You're using that to guide the discussion, almost like a little bit of a guide through it. So I think that works really well. I think it does put a more challenge on the presenter to prepare these things that are self-explanatory and testing to make sure it makes sense. I also think that the memo piece, the written period, personal opinion, people learn in different ways. I think for me, if I see a lot of table of numbers, I don't see the patterns. But if you put it into a couple of graphs and you put some of those things and overlays, then the story starts to become much clearer. And so I think if doing that where you're setting the pre-read, asking people to prepare for it and just facilitating discussion, really making sure that it is easily consumable to a lot of audiences and that people learn in different ways, avoid sending huge tables of numbers and things like that, because people don't see the patterns. And you got to find a way to use graphs or at least highlights or circles or something to say, here's where I want to draw your attention so they get the point. Without that, you could send a pre-read and a bunch of tables of numbers and you get in the session and then the audience will say, well, tell me about that. Tell me about that. Tell me about that. And you totally lose control of the situation and the story you're trying to tell. So having those sort of visual guideposts along the way makes a huge difference to helping you facilitate that discussion later on. So
Uh, so then to close out before we get into the lightning round, can I just ask you about these presentations that we just went through, right? Where you're collecting internal data, you're looking at external benchmarking data, you're coming up with hypotheses, connecting the two, and then combining it to make a recommendation about a particular investment or decision or priority such that you can get influence, you're influencing and aligning a stakeholder group,
mhm.
right? It's a lot of things to do. What is your expectation from your team or from folks who are just in the HR kind of career ladder to be able to put all these pieces of the puzzle together? I would assume that you think this is a core part of what a CHRO should be doing. But then how do you think about that in terms of how you're hiring for folks or how you're helping develop folks or in terms of like advice that you're giving younger folks who are thinking about getting into this function?
I think part of that is, I'd say facilitation. Nobody to describe as not necessarily in your HR team, does everybody have all the data. You're probably pulling from the people analytics team, survey data. You're probably pulling compensation data and money data from somebody else and something from somebody else. And so I think where it works really well is you get the group together and say, here's the question we're trying to answer. And here's the idea of think how we might be able to do it in different pieces, but you actually bring that little group together for a really quick working session to frame out what you want to do and have the brainstorm for folks that kind of bring those different pieces together. So I think that little facilitation, you get more people working on it, parallel processing, you get through it faster and actually that raises the acumen of the team. I think that's a really good, here's the problem, question we're trying to answer. So I think HR leaders, whatever level you're at, frame out the question and then try to pull in those elements. And that works. It helps you to get there faster versus one person alone trying to do it all in their space. I think going back to the question in terms of the coaching, I do think that basic skill set, like these examples I just showed, were all just Excel and Power. It was nothing special about them, pivot tables and things like that. But being able to do those items is key. I think the other thing I'd say is get knowledgeable around external data sources you can bring in. And it may not be a perfect alignment benchmark, but there may be stories or examples that are related to what you're trying to tell that help you illustrate the point. I'll use a quick example is, let's say you're trying to promote a leadership development program that you want to launch in your company. You don't have 5 years to do PhD level research on effectiveness of leadership development programs. You can tell your story, but you can bring in 3 or 4 studies or things like that from other credible sources to help tell your story. So I think business leaders are more influenced if they can see externally about trends in the world, trends of other companies, things like that. It helps them feel much more comfortable about the situation and more comfortable making a decision. So I'd say if you're learning those internal data analysis skills and being knowledgeable of outside sources you can use, reading different areas, different websites, different journals, et cetera, that can really help you reinforce and tell your story. And then again, I just say, one thing I say is practice. Get with a safe place as you're putting something together. Get a friend, a work friend, and practice somebody that's willing to give you that full transparent feedback in a positive, helpful way. That makes a huge difference. So you do these 3 or 4 times, and then suddenly it starts to feel a lot more second nature.
Uh, with all that said, then, Craig, are you ready to get into a quick lightning round where we can go through some of these things in 30 seconds or less?
You got it. 30 seconds or less. Yes.
So let's start with an easy one. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
Mornings. I think 90% of my ideas are in the first 2 hours of the day. So getting a good night's sleep and then capturing those things right away in the morning. That's the way to go.
So within the world of people analytics, where do you think things are headed in terms of trends? What's a trend within the world of people analytics that you've been following closely and think will be having a major impact over the next few years?
Path. I am not an expert in this. If you do some of the analysis work, you could put your data together and you spend a half a day trying to analyze and find the patterns. At some point here with some of the AI tools, you're going to be able to put that in some kind of AI system and they're going to find the patterns in 10 seconds that used to take you a half day. I've heard some people say that, AI will only replace your job if you don't learn how to use AI. So I think that is going to be a core piece of it's not going to replace the human analysis and creativity and asking questions, but using that tool to help you speed through things more quickly, that'll be a big advancement for us.
Uh, so is there a piece of career advice you've ever received that sticks out that you'd be willing to share with us?
Sure. I would say is don't be afraid to jump into a more complicated situation. And if you shy away from the harder projects or the special projects or things that are a little bit messier, you don't learn as fast. When you jump into something that's messy, you learn fast and you probably get more visibility and more upward momentum as well in your career. So don't be afraid, jump in. You're supposed to be half confident, half nervous. And if you're in that space, you're probably in the right place.
Okay, so then if you could wave a magic wand and improve something about the way HR departments work today, what would that be?
I think over time and resource management, tracking time, understand how people use their time, how many people we have, where we have them, how are they being utilized, that whole world of being able to measure your resources fully is many companies spend a lot of time trying to track and understand time and where we're spending our efforts and our work and what's value add, what's not value add. So if I had a magic wand and I could get that time and resource data right there, that would be amazing. So someday.
Gotcha. With all that said, I want to thank you. Special thanks to you, Craig, for coming in prepared with some of these great examples that really help people connect the concept of data analysis, looking at external benchmarks, combining that with storytelling to really get a group aligned towards a particular program or investment. This is something that I think HR professionals definitely struggle through independently, individually, all the time. And it is clearly a skill set that will future proof anyone, right, in their HR career and dare I say, just more broadly. And so I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And with that said, I'm going to say that's a wrap for today's episode of the Future Proof HR podcast. One more time, thank you, Craig, for sharing your insights. And we will be hopefully inspiring people to think about human capital management a little bit differently. Until next time, folks. Bye now.
Hey, it's Thomas again. One quick question before you go. Are you and your HR team tired of answering the same employee questions again and again in Slack? If yes, our Cleary AI-powered Slack bot is here to help. It takes routine employee requests and answers it automatically while freeing up time for you to take on more important tasks. At the same time, it automatically builds up an HR knowledge base as you go. It's quick to set up, works right in Slack, and you can try it for free. Just head on over to gocleary.com/HR-chatbot to install it. It's again, gocleary.com/HR-chatbot. Thanks again.